One of the things that makes Star Trek Adventures really stand out as a role-playing game is the extended task mechanic. It's something which comes after you master the basic task system and momentum and threat and possibly scenes and traits. But nevertheless, it's something which allows engineers and scientists to shine in a way above and beyond a single die roll and to create drama around the challenges that are before them. Mr. Scott and all of the really intense challenges that he had before him in the original series is of course the prime example. But there are other ways of deploying this mechanic for synthesizing a vaccine, for interrogating a prisoner with security, for kind of imagining some tense negotiations with command. The character that's at the center of the extended task is going to need a little bit of help from his friends, of course. And there's a lot of different moving parts to this mechanic that allow it to create a real sensation of drama and a sensation that the task could be left half finished if there's not a final sprint. Now, the different ingredients that go into this we will visit in just a little while. But I think suffice it to say, I think it doesn't take a whole lot of convincing for people to see that in the Star Trek genre, there are lots of things that have a beginning, middle, and end, and possibly will get interrupted or might need a little bit of extra steam and perspiration from the protagonists to see them really finished. And that's where this mechanic really finds its voice. An important disclaimer here is that right there in the rules, it does say that this is something that you shouldn't use all the time, and that you should take care to make sure it's very connected to the fiction in the game, or it can get very repetitive and number-based. And another really important disclaimer that not only the book, but I will go out of my way to kind of point out here, is that extended tasks take place within time-sensitive situations. And that's described by the time challenge mechanic. And so before we delve in deep to the nuts and bolts of extended tasks, the magnitude, the work track, the breakthroughs, the resistance, the base difficulty, and everything else that's going on outside of extended tasks, let's look at the context called time challenges.
One thing to keep in mind about extended tasks is that they're built to exist within the time challenge mechanic. For one reason or another, time is of the essence when it comes to completing this task. In the Galileo 7, Mr. Scott only has so much time to get the Galileo flying again. If the shuttlecraft doesn't make contact with the Enterprise in time, the Enterprise will have moved on to deliver the medicines to a plague-stricken planet, which leaves the survivors of the Galileo stranded. At the outset of a time challenge, the Game Master sets out how many intervals there are available before time is up. The rules also say that the Game Master sketches out how long a duration of IRL time a given interval is. Now, the number of intervals available has a lot to do with how many tasks the player characters are going to attempt over the course of the challenge, because each attempt at a task consumes 2 intervals, and the advice in the rulebook goes to the tune of allocating about 2 to 3 times the number of tasks that will be a part of the challenge. Now, since this video is about extended tasks, we're instead concerned with how many attempts at the extended task the player characters are going to have to make. And that's largely a function of magnitude. When we get into the anatomy of extended tasks in just a little bit, I'll explain what magnitude is. The very, very short version of it is that it's basically how many telling or really good hits on the task the player characters are going to have to make. So for a really quick example, in the Galileo 7, maybe Mr. Scott needs to assess the damage. He needs to get the Galileo into flying shape by reducing the flying weight. And then finally, he needs to find a source of power or fuel. So let's call the task magnitude 3. So at the bottom end of the spectrum for intervals, 2 times 3 is 6. This is if you want things to be very intense, if you want the outcome to be in doubt, and you want the player characters to be pulling out all the stops. As you get closer to 3 intervals times the magnitude of the task, then things are getting a little bit easier, and beyond that, it's sort of just shooting the breeze and maybe not worth the time of covering it because their characters aren't really under much pressure. At this higher end, maybe there are intervening factors. Maybe the problem with the Neanderthals is going to preoccupy a little bit more of this challenge. So anytime anybody does something that amounts to a task, it consumes 2 intervals. They can spend 1 momentum to reduce this to 1 interval. So probably things that people are doing outside of the shuttlecraft, they're going to need to be doing this. Everything consumes time. If you remember Galileo 7, Mr. Spock is under intense time pressure, not just when it comes to what's going on with Scotty, but all over the place. And finally, a complication on a task can cost an extra interval as time gets wasted. So regardless of if you go to the lengths of using the nuts and bolts of this time challenge mechanic when you use extended tasks, this is the regime that they're expected to be working under. There's limited time available. The player characters know how much time they have. Everything outside of the core task is still consuming time. And finally, the player characters have the option of burning momentum to really be efficient with their time, and possibly complications could cost them time.
So thank you, Thought Bubble. We got that out of the way quickly. And now we can talk about what's really going on under the hood with extended tasks. The first thing to remember and note is that extended tasks aren't that different than other tasks. There's a task leader, the primary character who's rolling the 2d20 at the heart of the task. There's the preconditions and the consequences of the task. For example, what happens when you fail? What do you need in order to make the task at all, as in a tool, a starship, or a team around you? And what kind of traits are in the scene that can be affecting the difficulty? What separates extended tasks is that they're probably something that takes more than that couple of minutes sitting down at a computer, or just kind of a reflexive singular test, which is what an ordinary garden variety task might be. An important thing to note is just like any other task, an extended task has a base difficulty. It could be 2 or 1 or 3, depending on sort of the circumstances around it, and that will hold constant across all the various attempts. Now, you may have heard tell that one of the things that really describes how big an extended task is its magnitude. That's how long it's really going to take and how many really telling rolls that are going to need to be made against this task to see it past the finish line. Now, when you succeed in an extended task, whether you really got through the magnitude, whether you made a breakthrough, your insights, or your hard work, or just your sheer moxie managed to get something done meaningfully on this task, is the question about if you got a breakthrough. And for this, challenge dice come into play. A skilled character adds their discipline that they're using for the task to just a base 2. So an engineer could be rolling up to 7 challenge dice against an extended task. Getting these breakthroughs is a matter of rolling 5 or more on the challenge dice total. Now, the excess points that you roll don't go to waste, and if you succeed at the task but don't reach that breakthrough level, that's not wasted either. All of the points that you roll on the challenge dice become work that goes onto the work track. Now, this is where kind of the ordinary working man effort, the stuff that would never represent a breakthrough or a killer insight, could finish things eventually. That's sort of what the scale of a work track is. And it's approximately 5 times the magnitude. And the purpose that the work track serves is to create an alternate way of earning breakthroughs. Now, when you run the work track down to 0 or fill it up, depending on how you're looking at things, you can get an additional breakthrough. So if you get 5 work and you fill up the work track, that's 2 breakthroughs at once. Or if the work track is already full and you manage to do any work at all, that can also be a breakthrough. And that condition also of doing any work while it's at 0 and doing at least 5 work can be combined also. So that's another way to get 2 breakthroughs at once. And this is an important tool in looking at extended tasks. The players will be looking for these finish line moments where they can get 2 breakthroughs at once. And they likely will take some risks to get them, and it's something to anticipate. Magnitude 3 extended tasks will often be completed in only 2 attempts because of this. So keep that in mind when you're designing challenges and adventure environments, and especially with magnitude 2 tasks. So what are the tools that the players have in their toolbox to interact with how much work they're getting done on the extended task? Well, first of all, they can spend momentum to re-roll the challenge dice pool. And as with any other kind of re-roll, you can scoop only the dice that you don't like and keep the dice that you do. So it's pretty easy to kind of piece together 5 from a single re-roll. They can also spend a point of momentum just raw to add 1 point to the challenge dice total. And finally, they can spend a point of momentum to reduce the resistance the extended task has by 2. And we'll discuss what resistance is here in just a moment. Suffice to say, player characters are going to be wanting to exceed the base difficulty, and they're going to be looking to earn momentum in other places with their allies completing tasks as well. And outside of these core momentum spends, the player characters that are satellites to the task leader can be attempting things to really affect these work track rolls as well. For example, you could be creating advantages that allow effects on the challenge dice to count as +1 work, or to kind of knock down the resistance that we're going to talk about right now. So resistance is very akin to a damage reduction concept in other systems that you might be familiar with. It's just a deduction from the work that you may get done. And so really kind of difficult tasks where kind of the ordinary sort of hard effort is almost negated, where you may paddle upstream and the current sweeps you downward. That's the sort of thing that resistance can be. It's something which means that, like, I tried, sir, and I did everything I'm supposed to, but I still didn't get there. And resistance is especially taxing when it comes to momentum, because you got to get through that resistance to try and get to 5, or resistance is even more taxing because it may cause the task to require more attempts. It may be that the characters give up entirely on hitting 5 and instead are just trying to get to filling the work track. And when you design these extended tasks, it's important to consider what kind of completion method the players might seek out and which one you might be leading them towards. Alright, so I just assaulted you with a lot of terms of art, with a lot of sort of fancy words, and now we need to get into some kind of practical examples of what the extended task mechanic looks like in play, what it could be used to describe when the characters are at the table, or when you need to make up something on the fly that is difficult, is under time pressure, and likely, will take more than one sitting. That could be an extended task that you pull out right there in the moment. So let's do a couple of examples inside of the thought bubble. Here we go.
The practical example of an extended task that we'll be looking at is from a TOS one-shot that I ran called Repatriation. The context here is that a Federation starship is looking to recover a scout ship that was lost on the Klingon side of the border during a period of intense conflict or wartime. Some indeterminate time after the war, and during an uneasy peace, the Klingon High Command has contacted Starfleet and said, "Come get your garbage." Of course, Starfleet is very interested in recovering the people and whatever intelligence might be aboard. And of course, there's a mystery of why would the Klingons do the courtesy to Starfleet of informing them? That's another question on the table. So the extended task takes place when the player characters are going to beam over to the wreck of this scout ship, an Archer-class scout ship, scale 2, and they're going to try and recover as much data, as much of the logs as they possibly can, so they can get some insight into what happened aboard and what happened to the people. The standing scene traits that we have in play here are radiometric interference, the generalized radiation environment that the whole ship is bathed in because of whatever happened to it. This trait is why an away team is necessary, is because remotely contacting whatever's left of the scout ship's computers isn't possible, and also just kind of remote scanning is not going to be on the table. It's also why the task is time sensitive, is because this radiation is dangerous for the crew that are there. They got to bug out and go home and let the transporter buffer clean the radiation out of their genome. And it's a one-time trip because those mutations are probably not something that you want to play with repeating. And to boot, the Klingons are always looking over Starfleet's shoulder. They're escorting this player character ship through Klingon space, so there's a limited amount of time and patience that the Klingons have for what the player characters are up to. The next trait in play is Ghost Ship, which is sort of a relic of the fate that this ship befell. There's some aliens that took over and kind of made it into a house or possibly a storage unit, a place where they keep their cultural artifacts. They come from a cold planet like Titan, and these are carved blocks of water ice. So these blocks of ice are all over the ship, kind of littering the floor like cardboard boxes. And on top of that, there's the remains of a melee between these aliens and a Klingon boarding party. So there's bodies all over, there's ice all over, and there's no trace of the crew besides their personal effects, their mementos, their little family photos, and hopefully their logs. So all told, that adds up to the ghost ship trait. Finally, there's the power offline trait, which leads to all the kind of garden variety problems that you're used to, like flickering lights, inability to address a computer without getting under the hood, manually opening doors with just your muscle power, that sort of thing. This is the trait that the characters are most likely to affect. There's a lot of avenues, beaming power from their starship, or getting a reactor online, or just plugging in a battery or hot wiring an individual system. So let's get on to the anatomy of the extended task itself. I set the magnitude at 3, and that means that there's going to be something between 6 and 9 intervals. I set it at 8 because a lot of these traits could really affect the difficulty. Meanwhile, the base difficulty is set at 2 because this isn't that hard. It should be pretty intuitive to find enough data to piece together what happened to the crew. I've left it an open question which discipline is to be used. It could be command because a command supervisor would be able to sort of snoop through people's business and think about what their subordinates, had they been aboard this scout ship, were up to. It could be con as a matter of sort of thinking about standard protocols and polish the copper sort of procedures. It could be security because this is sort of a fundamentally gumshoey task. And finally, it could be science because you need to figure out what's wrong with the computers and fix it. And of course, most saliently, it's likely engineering because you're trying to fix this computer to get information out of it. I've got the work track set at 12, which is just the least bit lower than 5 times the magnitude, which promises the possibility of sort of getting that finish line moment of 2 breakthroughs at once. And that turned out to be really important because of the context that unfolded within the scene. When the player characters beamed over, they were very wary that there was likely a Klingon trap, and so they spent 2 intervals just kind of making sure that everything was safe inside the transporter room and scanning the corridors and so on. Then they tried to turn the power back on, and they managed to get limited power on board to the bridge. And they also searched the quarters, the crew quarters, to get a little bit more progress and pick up some personal logs. And then finally, from the bridge console, under the hood, messing with the isolinear chips, they managed to finish the job. When I ran the adventure, the away team consisted of Darius Merrick, the first officer of the ship, and Ari Haretz, the chief engineer, as well as John Security, who of course was the chief of security. In the transporter room, John and Merrick scanned the rest of the ship and established that things were safe. John also experienced a complication associated with the ghost ship trait, and he got a little bit on edge. At this point, appropriate to the context, they split up, and I was careful to telegraph that it would only be a single task of movement to get to anyone who experienced trouble. Merrick searched the crew quarters, while Ari went to the bridge to try and get things moving with the computer, and John went to main engineering to see if he could get the power back online. The radiation was too intense in main engineering, and so John joined Ari on the bridge. John worked to hotwire a computer console for an uplink to the player character's larger vessel. Ari secured that uplink. Meanwhile, Merrick was able to stumble upon some personal logs and get the first breakthrough. At this point, I had some of these logs typed up that would tell some of the mystery of what happened to the scout ship, and that allowed us to stay more immersed in the fiction and keep in mind what this extended task was all about. So while Merrick's player was reading to himself some of this log, Ari, assisted by John, made a balls-to-the-wall check to try and get the extended task done. Using his engineering discipline of 5, and I believe he also had In the Nick of Time that added an additional work point to any effects that he rolled, they were able to complete the task just as they ran out of intervals. At this point, I probably would have started inflicting stress on their characters had they remained, or created a value complication as the ship's doctor really compelled them to return, else they suffer some long-term consequences. The players went into the scene with very little threat in the pool, which allowed them to purchase a lot of dice and get a lot of momentum, and they were able to use that momentum to buy down the number of intervals that were expiring. I've tracked the tasks that they attempted that burnt intervals, and so keep this in mind. This is a good example of how extended tasks work. I'm going to save a second example for a later video because it turns out that this was a pretty long recap.
So that wraps up our overview of extended tasks. I hope that this gives you the basic tools as a player to understand and be ready for this mechanic when it comes up, and as a game master to structure these challenges in a way that will be compelling, interesting, and less than just sort of an attrition slog versus numbers. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of your ideas about how you've applied this mechanic, because it really does open up a lot of doors to creativity, and it gets you thinking about Trek episodes that linger in your memory. Sometime in the future, I will be doing a strategy for extended tasks video that'll talk about game master strategy for how to move the different variables around when you're designing the task, and also as players, kind of how to approach the task, how to save those intervals, and how to save your strength, and possibly how to avoid creating overmuch threat. That's going to be a lot of fun. Let's talk about it next time. I'm the Complex Games Apologist.